Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of New Orleans. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time at which you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1844, and New Orleans was a city of contrasts. Opulent wealth alongside desperate poverty, European refinement mixing with Caribbean influences, and a society built on appearances that masked darker truths. Among the city's elite, the Blackwood family name commanded respect and a certain wariness. Their mansion on Prytania Street stood as a testament to their position. 3 stories of Greek Revival architecture with imposing white columns and wrought iron balconies that seemed to watch over the oak-lined avenue like silent sentinels. On the night of October 17, 1844, that mansion became a funeral pyre. According to the New Orleans Picayune's account published the following day, the occupants perished when flames engulfed their home during what should have been an ordinary Thursday evening. The fire was so intense that it took nearly 3 hours to extinguish, leaving nothing but a blackened skeleton of what had once been one of the city's most impressive residences. The official report, filed by City Constable James Wilkins, listed the cause as accidental, likely originating from an unattended hearth or candle. But there was something about the case that didn't align with the official narrative, something that wasn't discussed in polite company. The bodies recovered from the ashes were found in peculiar positions, not scattered throughout the house as one would expect if the occupants had been attempting to flee, but gathered in the central parlor, arranged in what appeared to be a semicircle, and more disturbingly, according to notes made by the coroner, but omitted from the official death certificates, several of the bodies showed evidence of restraints. These inconsistencies might have been pursued further had it not been for the influence of Alexander Blackwood's business partner, Thomas Harrington, who seemed particularly eager to have the matter settled quickly. A tragic accident, he told the Picayune, nothing more than an unfortunate confluence of circumstances. The investigation was closed within a week. For nearly 15 years, the story of the Blackwood tragedy was relegated to whispered conversations and occasional references in discussions of historic fires. The property remained vacant, a charred reminder of tragedy that locals hurried past, until 1859, when a collection of letters was discovered during the demolition of an adjacent property, correspondence that cast the events of that October night in a profoundly different light. What follows is an account pieced together from those letters, parish records, personal diaries, and testimonies that were initially suppressed. It is a story of ambition, jealousy, and the darkness that can fester within the walls of even the most respectable homes. This is the macabre story of the Blackwood mansion, what truly happened before the flames, what the fire was meant to conceal, and why some in New Orleans still claim that on certain October nights the scent of smoke drifts down Prytania Street, accompanied by sounds that no living person should make. Alexander Blackwood arrived in New Orleans in 1832, a man of 35, with ambitions that matched the rapidly growing city. He brought with him a modest inheritance, a sharp business acumen, and his young bride, Eleanor, whose family connections in Charleston opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. Within 3 years, Alexander had established himself in the shipping business, his vessels carrying cotton, sugar, and other goods between New Orleans and ports throughout the Atlantic. The Blackwoods' rise in New Orleans society was methodical and deliberate. They attended the right churches, made the right donations, and by 1836 had commissioned the construction of their Prytania Street home. By all accounts, the couple appeared to be living an exemplary life. Alexander's business thrived. Eleanor became known for her charitable work with the Sisters of Mercy, and the household was described by visitors as refined and impeccably maintained What few knew was that beneath this veneer of respectability, Alexander was developing interests of a darker nature. His shipping business regularly took him to Havana, and beginning around 1839, these trips grew longer and more frequent. Customs records show that while his early voyages typically lasted no more than a week, his later visits often extended to 3 weeks or more. What occurred during these extended stays was not documented in his business correspondence, which maintained a strictly professional tone. However, a journal kept by a former business associate, Richard Thornton, offers some insight. Thornton accompanied Alexander on a trip to Cuba in 1840 and later wrote, "A has developed a fascination with certain native religious practices that I find deeply troubling. On 2 evenings he disappeared from our lodgings after dark and returned, near dawn, disheveled and oddly exhilarated. When pressed, he spoke vaguely of ceremonies that expand the mind and suggested that I might accompany him on the next occasion. I declined, citing stomach upset. In truth, the gleam in his eye as he described these rituals filled me with a dread I cannot adequately express." Thornton severed his business relationship with Alexander shortly after their return to New Orleans. In a letter explaining his decision, he wrote only of irreconcilable differences regarding appropriate business practices. The specific nature of these differences was never elaborated upon in any surviving correspondence. Those who moved in closer circles with the Blackwoods noted certain oddities in their household. Alexander was known to be excessively controlling domestic matters. A former housemaid, Marie Laveau, no relation to the famous voodoo practitioner, noted in an interview conducted in 1862 that Monsieur Blackwood insisted on locking all the exterior doors himself each night, keeping the keys on his person. Madame was not permitted to leave the grounds without his knowledge, and visitors were received only by prior arrangement. Eleanor Blackwood, once described as vivacious and charming by childhood acquaintances, grew increasingly withdrawn as the years passed. Parish records from St. Louis Cathedral indicate she attended confession with unusual frequency, sometimes daily during certain periods. Father Benoit, who later relocated to a parish in Baton Rouge, noted in his personal journal that Mrs. Beadpoyd confessions grow increasingly troubling. She speaks of fears that she cannot articulate and of dreams in which she is unable to protect herself from some unnamed harm. I have suggested she confide in her husband, but this suggestion seems to distress her further. By 1842, Eleanor's health had begun to deteriorate. Medical records from Dr. James Metcalf, a prominent New Orleans physician, document complaints of insomnia, loss of appetite, and what was described as nervous exhaustion. Dr. Metcalf prescribed regular doses of laudanum, a common treatment. At the time for what would now likely be diagnosed as depression or anxiety. In his notes, he observed that Mrs. Blackwood exhibits a pronounced startle response to sudden sounds or movements, and appears fearful when her husband enters the room, though she vehemently denies any marital difficulties when questioned directly. These scattered observations might have amounted to nothing more than the ordinary complications of marriage, were it not for the contents of Eleanor Blackwood's private diary recovered from a locked box in the ruins. The entries from the summer of 1844 paint a picture of a household under mounting tension. A grows more agitated by the day, she wrote on July 23rd. The shipment from Havana has been delayed again, and he speaks of obligations that cannot be deferred. Last night I heard him in the cellar again. The sounds carry through the heating grate in our bedroom. On August 4th, she wrote, I found strange markings drawn in chalk on the cellar floor today. A discovered me there and became enraged in a way I have never witnessed before. His face transformed. I can only describe it as a mask dropping away. To reveal something foreign beneath, he gripped my arm with such force that I now bear 5 distinct bruises. He made me swear never to enter that space again, saying it was consecrated ground, and my presence polluted the preparations. What preparations? I dare not ask. An entry from August 17th reveals further deterioration in the household. A no longer comes to our bed. He spends his nights in what he calls his sanctuary, the room on the third floor that remains perpetually locked. The few times I have pressed my ear to the door, I have heard him speaking, though there is never anyone else present. The language is not one I recognize. The cadence is rhythmic, almost like a chant or incantation. I find myself increasingly afraid of my own husband. What exactly Alexander Blackwood was doing in the cellar remains unclear. The mansion's basement level was completely destroyed in the fire. The stonework cracked and collapsed from the intense heat. But shipping records and correspondence with a business associate in Cuba, Juan Martinez, suggest that Alexander may have been involved in activities beyond legitimate commerce. A coded letter found among Martinez's papers after his death in 1857 makes reference to special cargo that required discreet handling and appropriate storage facilities. Another letter, dated March 1844, is more explicit. The artifacts you requested have been secured, though at considerable expense and risk. The colonial authorities grow increasingly suspicious of shipments from the inland regions, particularly those associated with the old practices. The smaller items have been concealed within legitimate cargo as discussed. The larger piece, the altar stone, has required more elaborate arrangements. It will arrive separately, disguised as a marble slab for architectural purposes. Preparations for its consecration should begin immediately upon receipt. The alignment approaches, and there will not be another opportunity for 27 years. The summer of 1844 was also marked by a series of business setbacks for Alexander. The banking panic of the previous year had continued to reverberate through the economy, and 2 of Blackwood's ships were lost in a hurricane off the coast of Florida in August. His partnership with Thomas Harrington showed signs of strain. According to minutes from their company meetings, Harrington had begun to question certain expenditures and was pressing for a full audit of their accounts. A particularly heated exchange, documented by the company clerk, occurred on September 3rd. Harrington demanded explanation for a series of payments to J.M. Consultancy, totaling over $5,000, an enormous sum for the time. Alexander refused to provide details, stating only that the payments were essential to the long-term prosperity of our venture. When Harrington pressed further, Alexander reportedly said, "There are forces at work beyond your limited comprehension, Thomas. By October's end, our fortunes will be transformed in ways you cannot imagine." Harrington later confided to his brother in a private letter that he feared Alexander was becoming unhinged by our recent losses and was potentially dabbling in speculative investments that could bring ruin to us both. He mentioned plans to legally dissolve their partnership after the new year, noting that something in Alexander's manner of late fills me with a profound unease that I cannot shake. It was against this backdrop of financial pressure and household tension that September arrived, bringing with it a visitor whose presence would catalyze the events leading to that fatal October night. Jeremiah Blackwood, Alexander's younger brother, arrived from Boston on September 12, 1844. His stated purpose was to discuss a potential expansion of the family business, to include textile manufacturing, but correspondence between the brothers suggests a more complicated agenda. Jeremiah had not seen his brother in nearly a decade, and according to his letters to his wife in Boston, he was disturbed by the changes he observed. "Alexander is not the man I remember," he wrote on September 18th. "There is a coldness in him, now a calculation in his every word and gesture that I find unsettling. Eleanor seems afraid of her own shadow. Something is deeply wrong in this house." In a subsequent letter dated September 25th, Jeremiah elaborated on his concerns. The household functions as if under a pall. The servants move silently, avoiding Alexander's gaze. Eleanor flinches at unexpected sounds and watches the doors as if expecting some intrusion at any moment. Alexander himself has developed habits that strike me as bizarre. He mutters phrases in what sounds like garbled Latin when he believes himself unobserved, and I have twice caught him tracing symbols on various surfaces with his fingertips. Most troubling to Jeremiah was his discovery of a hidden room on the 3rd floor of the mansion. "I was searching for Alexander late one evening," he wrote to his wife on October 2nd, "when I observed him entering what I had assumed was a linen closet at the end of the hallway. Curiosity led me to investigate after he had retired for the night. What I found was not a closet at all, but a small chamber obscured from casual view by a cleverly designed false wall. Jeremiah's description of this room is disturbing. The space contained no furniture save a small altar-like table at its center, upon which rested a stone slab inscribed with symbols similar to those I had observed Alexander tracing. The walls were covered with elaborate diagrams, rendered in what appeared to be a mixture of charcoal and some reddish substance I hesitate to identify. A strong odor of incense permeated the air, metallic and unpleasant, quite unlike the church incense with which I am familiar. Most distressing were the restraints I observed fixed to the floor before the altar, leather straps attached to metal rings embedded in the wood. I cannot imagine their purpose, but my mind conjures only the darkest possibilities. Jeremiah extended his stay, originally planned for 1 week, to nearly a month. During this time, he made several attempts to speak privately with Eleanor, but, according to his letters, Alexander seemed determined to prevent such conversations. "He is always there, always watching," Jeremiah wrote. When I suggested taking Eleanor for an afternoon in the park, he invented an immediate errand that required his wife's attention. On October 7th, Jeremiah finally managed to speak with Eleanor alone, while Alexander was meeting with business associates. His letter to his wife that evening reveals the disturbing content of their conversation. E broke down entirely once assured of our privacy. Through her tears, she confessed fears that A has become involved in some form of heretical practice during his Cuban travels. She spoke of strange artifacts arriving disguised as ordinary shipments, of A's insistence on performing cleansing rituals upon her that leave her weakened and disoriented, of his increasing references to the approaching alignment, and the offering that must be made. Most alarmingly, Eleanor confided to Jeremiah that Alexander had begun selecting specific household staff for what he termed special service, after which they would disappear from the household. When she inquires about these sudden departures, Jeremiah wrote, A provides vague explanations about better positions elsewhere, but E has observed that these individuals never return to collect their remaining belongings, and their families, in the city, received no word from them. On October 10th, just 1 week before the fire, Jeremiah made a visit to the offices of Pritchard and Stone, attorneys at law. The nature of this consultation was not recorded, but Jeremiah withdrew a significant sum from his account at the Louisiana State Bank the same day. In his final letter to his wife, dated October 15th, he wrote, "I have made certain arrangements that I hope will never be necessary, but if they are, know that I acted as conscience demanded. I return home on the morning of the 18th. There are matters I dare not commit to paper that I will explain upon my return." This letter suggests that Jeremiah had developed a plan to remove Eleanor from the household, possibly involving legal measures to protect her from Alexander. His intention to depart on the 18th indicates that whatever intervention he planned was scheduled for the 17th, the very day of the fire. Jeremiah never returned to Boston. According to the official record, he died alongside the others in the Blackwood household in the fire 2 nights later. But here, the story takes a perplexing turn. The passenger manifest of the steamboat Mississippi Siren, which departed New Orleans for Natchez on the morning of October 17th, lists a J. Blackwood among its passengers. This document was not discovered until 1863, when a researcher compiling a history of river transportation came across it in the archives of the Steamboat Company. If Jeremiah Blackwood left New Orleans on the morning of the fire, then who was among the bodies recovered from the ruins? The coroner's report identifies the remains as those of Alexander, Eleanor, Jeremiah, and 2 adult individuals presumed to be household staff. Yet employment records indicate that the Blackwoods' cook and housekeeper, Lucinda Taylor and Martha Green, had given notice 2 weeks earlier and departed the household on October 5th. The mystery deepened when a reporter for the New Orleans Tribune, investigating the case in 1864, located Lucinda Taylor living in Baton Rouge. Her account of her final weeks in the Blackwood household adds another disturbing dimension to the narrative. "I left because I feared for my life," she stated. Mr. Blackwood had begun selecting staff members for what he called private ceremonies in the cellar. Those chosen never returned to their duties. When he approached me, saying I had been selected for a higher purpose, I fabricated a family emergency and fled that very night, not even waiting to collect my wages. Taylor's testimony suggests that Alexander may have been using household staff for some form of sacrificial ritual. If true, this raises questions about the identities of at least some of the bodies found in the ruins. Were they indeed staff, members who had not managed to escape Alexander's selection, rather than the individuals named in the official report? The day of October 17th proceeded without notable incident, according to what few accounts exist. Alexander attended a business meeting at the offices of Blackwood and Harrington from 10 until noon. Eleanor visited St. Louis Cathedral for confession at 2 o'clock. Neighbors reported nothing unusual about the household's activities. What is known with certainty is that on October 15th, 2 days before the fire, a merchant vessel from Havana, the Estrella del Mar, docked in New Orleans. The harbor master's records show that among its passengers were J. Martinez and associate. Customs declarations list their cargo as personal effects and items of scholarly interest, the latter described as books and manuscripts related to historical practices of the Caribbean region. No record exists of where Martinez and his companions stayed during their visit, but a notation in Alexander's personal calendar, recovered partially burned from the ruins, shows an entry for October 17th. 8 p.m. M and P arrive for final preparations, circle to be completed by midnight. This suggests that Martinez and his companion were expected at the Blackwood mansion on the evening of the fire. As evening fell on October 17th, a light rain began to fall over New Orleans, and a mist rose from the Mississippi. The first indication that something was amiss came at approximately 8:15 p.m., when a neighbor, Mrs. Claudia Beaumont, observed a man leaving the Blackwood mansion in what she described as a state of some agitation. In her statement to the constable, she noted that the man was wearing a dark coat and hat pulled low, and that he was carrying a small valise. She assumed he was a business associate departing after an evening meeting. This individual may have been Jeremiah Blackwood, though if so, his presence at the mansion that evening contradicts the steamboat manifest indicating his departure that morning. Alternatively, it could have been someone else fleeing the house before whatever events Alexander had planned were set in motion. At 9:30 p.m., another neighbor, retired Colonel James Forsyth, noticed an unusual amount of lamplight in the windows of the Blackwood home. Every room appeared to be illuminated, he later stated, which seemed excessive given the hour. At approximately 10:15 p.m., the colonel was preparing for bed when he heard what he described as a commotion from the direction of the Blackwood property, raised voices, though I could not discern the words, and what sounded like furniture being moved forcefully. The colonel considered investigating, but was deterred by the increasingly heavy rainfall. This decision would haunt him in later years. In an interview given in 1860, he reflected, Had I followed my instincts and gone to inquire about the disturbance, perhaps the tragedy might have been averted. Instead, I told myself it was not my place to interfere in a neighbor's domestic affairs. By morning, there was nothing left to save. The fire was first spotted at 10:40 p.m. by a night watchman making his rounds. By the time the fire brigade arrived, at 10:55 p.m., the first floor of the mansion was fully engulfed, and flames had begun to climb the exterior walls to the upper stories. Despite their efforts, the structure was beyond saving. By 2 a.m., all that remained was a smoking shell. The official investigation concluded that the fire began in the main parlor and spread rapidly due to the oiled wood paneling and heavy draperies. But this narrative was challenged by Isaiah Mercer, a member of the fire brigade, who noted in a letter to his brother that the fire had multiple points of origin, as if someone had deliberately set blazes throughout the ground floor. This observation was not included in the official report. Even more troubling was Mercer's description of the fire itself. In 15 years of service, I have never witnessed flames behave in such a manner. They seemed to move against the wind, spreading in patterns that defied natural explanation. The color, too, was unusual, a deep crimson at the core with edges that burned with a bluish tinge. Several of my colleagues remarked upon it, though none wished to be quoted in the official account for fear of appearing superstitious. The remains were recovered over the next 2 days as the ruins cooled enough to permit search efforts. The bodies were badly burned, making identification difficult, but clothing fragments and jewelry items were used to establish identities. Alexander was reportedly identified by his distinctive gold pocket watch, which survived the fire with its inscription intact. Eleanor was identified by her wedding ring. The coroner's report, while officially recording the cause of death as immolation due to accidental fire, contained several annotations that were subsequently omitted from the public record. These notes, discovered during the 1860 reopening of the investigation, include the observation that the positioning of the remains suggests a deliberate arrangement rather than the random distribution typically observed in fire victims. The bodies appear to have been placed in a circular formation around a central point in what was formerly the main parlor. More disturbing was the coroner's notation that examination of bone fragments from the wrists and ankles of 3 victims reveals groove patterns consistent with restraints applied before death. No evidence of struggle or attempt to escape the fire is apparent in any of the remains, suggesting either that the victims were deceased before the fire began or were rendered incapable of movement. The funeral was held on October 21st, with Thomas Harrington arranging all details. The bodies were interred in the Blackwood family tomb at St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. Harrington subsequently took control of Blackwood's business interests, citing a partnership agreement that transferred ownership upon death. Within 6 months, he had sold the shipping fleet and liquidated most of the company's other assets. The ruins of the Blackwood mansion remained untouched for nearly a year, as legal questions regarding the estate were resolved. In September 1845, the property was purchased by the city for a fraction of its pre-fire value with the intention of clearing the site for public use. It was during this clearance work that workers made the first of several disturbing discoveries. Beneath the collapsed flooring of what had been Alexander's study, they uncovered a concealed stairway leading to a room not shown in the mansion's original architectural plans. This hidden chamber, approximately 10 feet square, contained a heavy wooden chair bolted to the floor with leather restraints attached to the arms and legs. The walls were lined with lead sheeting, apparently to muffle sound. A drain was installed in the center of the floor. The foreman of the clearance crew, Michael O'Malley, described the room in a letter to his cousin. "I have seen many strange things in my 20 years of work, but never anything that filled me with such immediate dread." The chair faced a wall on which someone had painted an elaborate design. Circles within circles, filled with writing in no language I recognize. The paint used appeared to be mixed with some metallic substance that caught the lantern light in a most unnatural way. But it was the drain that troubled me most. What purpose could such a feature serve, positioned directly beneath the chair with its restraints? I ordered the room sealed immediately and reported our findings to the city authorities. City officials quickly suppressed news of this discovery, but rumors spread nevertheless. The property remained vacant, the plans for public use quietly abandoned. For the next decade, the site was left to deteriorate further, becoming overgrown with weeds and creeping vines that seemed to swallow what remained of the structure. In 1859, when the neighboring property was slated for demolition, workers discovered a metal box concealed within a wall cavity. The box contained a collection of letters, most notably correspondence between Eleanor Blackwood and her sister in Charleston. These letters, dating from 1843 to just 3 days before the fire, revealed a household in the grip of escalating terror. "Alexander is not himself," Eleanor wrote in February 1844. "There is a coldness in his eyes that chills me to the bone. Last night he spoke of purification and necessary sacrifices. He spends hours alone in that room he thinks I don't know about. I hear sounds that I cannot and will not describe." By August, her fear had reached a breaking point. "I must get away," she wrote. "He has begun to look at me in a way that no husband should regard his wife. 2 nights ago he took me to the cellar and kept me there for hours. When I finally returned to our bedroom, I could barely walk. I have not spoken of it to anyone." The dated, most disturbing letter, dated September 30th, describes a ritual Eleanor witnessed accidentally. "I woke in the night to find A gone from our bed. Concerned, I searched the house and observed light coming from beneath the cellar door. Against my better judgment, I descended the stairs quietly. What I saw through the partially open door will haunt me for whatever remains of my life." Eleanor's description of the scene is fragmented, suggesting she wrote in a state of extreme distress. A stood before an altar of some kind, unclothed, his body painted with symbols. Before him knelt one of the housemaids, the girl he had selected the previous day. She appeared drugged or in a trance. A was speaking in that strange tongue, his voice rising and falling in a chant. On the altar lay a knife unlike any. "I have seen the blade curved and inscribed with more symbols," she continues. "I must have made some sound, for A suddenly turned toward the door. His face, God help me, his face was not his own. Something looked out through his eyes that I cannot bring myself to name. I fled upstairs and feigned sleep when he returned to our room an hour later. The maid was not present at breakfast. When I inquired, A informed me that she had departed to fulfill a greater purpose. There was blood beneath his fingernails, though he had clearly attempted to clean his hands. The final letter, dated October 14th, is perhaps the most chilling. Jeremiah has promised to help me. He returns to Boston on the 18th and will make arrangements. I will follow within the month, once he has secured a safe place. Alexander suspects nothing. He is too consumed by his private obsessions. The sounds from below grow worse. I find myself awake all night, afraid that if I close my eyes, I will be taken. 3 more days, just 3 more days, and help will be on its way. 3 days would have been October 17th, the day of the fire. The discovery of these letters prompted a quiet reopening of the investigation by the city constable's office in early 1860. Thomas Harrington, now one of the city's most prominent businessmen, was interviewed regarding his former partner. Records of this interview are notably sparse, indicating only that Mr. Harrington expressed shock at the suggestions raised and reaffirmed his belief that the fire was a tragic accident. However, Harrington's private actions tell a different story. Within days of the interview, he liquidated significant assets and booked passage to Europe. A letter to his attorney, discovered after Harrington's death in Paris in 1868, suggests knowledge he was unwilling to share publicly. The matters regarding the B property must remain sealed. Should anyone inquire further about the events of that October night or about the shipments from H, direct them to the official reports and nothing more. Some truths are too dangerous to acknowledge even after the passage of years. More revealing was the testimony of Julia Perkins, Eleanor's lady's maid, who had left the Blackwood household in August 1844, approximately 2 months before the fire. Located in a small town in Mississippi, where she had relocated shortly after leaving her position, Perkins provided a written statement that described Alexander Blackwood as a man consumed by dark impulses. He required strict obedience from everyone in the household, she wrote. The smallest infractions were met with excessive punishment. Madame lived in constant fear of displeasing him. On several occasions I observed Mr. Blackwood taking his wife to the lower level of the house late at night. Each time she returned, changed, quieter, somehow diminished. When I finally gathered the courage to ask her what happened during these sessions, she began to tremble so violently that I feared she might harm herself. I tendered my resignation the next day. Perkins's statement also made reference to Alexander's unusual religious practices. While the Blackwoods publicly attended services at the Episcopal Christ Church Cathedral, Perkins reported that Alexander maintained a private chapel in a secluded room on the 3rd floor of the mansion. He permitted no one to enter this room, she stated, but occasionally, late at night, I would hear chanting coming from behind the locked door. Once passing by, I detected the scent of a strange incense, sharp and metallic, unlike anything I had encountered before. Most disturbing was Perkins's account of what she observed through the keyhole of this room one night in July 1844. Curiosity overcame my fear, and I looked inside. Mr. Blackwood stood before a small altar, naked except for a strange medallion around his neck. He was performing some manner of ritual over a basin containing a dark liquid. As he chanted, he drew a knife across his palm, allowing his blood to drip into the basin. The liquid began to bubble and emit a faint glow, though no flame was present. I fled to my quarters and prayed until dawn. I gave notice the following week. The nature of Alexander Blackwood's private religious practices has been the subject of much speculation over the years. Some have suggested connections to certain esoteric societies that had established footholds in New Orleans during this period. Others have proposed more mundane explanations, that Alexander, under increasing financial and psychological strain, had developed idiosyncratic rituals as a means of maintaining a sense of control. What can be stated with more certainty is that in the weeks leading up to the fire, Alexander's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Business associates reported that he would sometimes stop mid-conversation, as if listening to voices only he could hear. He began to carry a small leather-bound book with him at all times, in which he was frequently observed writing in what one colleague described as a script unlike any I recognized. This book was presumably destroyed in the fire, but a page believed to have been torn from it was discovered in 1862, preserved between the pages of a volume in Thomas Harrington's library after his death. The text, written in a combination of Greek letters and symbols of unknown origin, has defied complete translation. The few phrases that scholars have tentatively identified include references to the cleansing flame and vessels emptied for higher purpose. As the reopened investigation proceeded, attention turned to the question of the identities of all the bodies found in the ruins. If, as the steamboat manifest suggested, Jeremiah Blackwood had departed New Orleans on the morning of the fire, then whose remains had been misidentified as his? And what became of Jeremiah himself? The first question found a potential answer in municipal records from October 1844. A report filed by the harbormaster noted the arrival of a merchant vessel from Havana on October 15th, carrying among its passengers J. Martinez and associate. This would align with the coded correspondence found among Martinez's papers, suggesting a planned meeting with Alexander. If Martinez and his companion were indeed visiting the Blackwood mansion on the night of the fire, they might account for some of the bodies. As for Jeremiah, no record of his arrival in Boston exists. The passenger manifest of the steamboat Mississippi Siren confirms that he boarded in New Orleans, but there is no documentation of his disembarkation in Natchez or any point beyond. His wife, after months without word, placed advertisements in newspapers throughout the Northeast and South seeking information about his whereabouts. These inquiries yielded no definitive results. One tantalizing clue emerged in 1866 when a former riverboat gambler named Edward Priest claimed in a memoir that he had encountered a man matching Jeremiah's description in a St. Louis hotel, November 1844. According to Priest, the man was traveling under an assumed name and appeared haunted by some terrible knowledge. During a late-night conversation over brandy, the man allegedly confided that he had escaped a house of horrors and was fleeing a evil that could not be eradicated, only contained. Priest's account includes a disturbing detail omitted from most published versions of his memoir. The stranger showed me a peculiar scar on his left wrist, a perfect circle surrounding a symbol that resembled an eye. He claimed it had been branded upon him during a moment of weakness and that it marked him as one who had glimpsed the threshold. He spoke of his brother as if the man were no longer human, but rather a vessel for something else, something that had been waiting for generations to find a suitable host. Whether this man was indeed Jeremiah Blackwood cannot be confirmed. If he did survive, he never publicly recounted his experiences in the Blackwood household or the events leading to the fire. His silence, whether maintained by choice or enforced by circumstance, has left a void in the narrative that's subsequent. Investigations have struggled to fill. By 1868, interest in the Blackwood case had largely faded. New Orleans, like much of the South, was preoccupied with the challenges of Reconstruction. The site of the mansion had finally been cleared and repurposed as a small park, though local residents reportedly avoided it after sunset. Thomas Harrington died that year of apparent heart failure, taking whatever knowledge he possessed of his former partner's activities to the grave. But in 1869, a final piece of the puzzle emerged, one that cast the events of October 17, 1844, in their most disturbing light yet. During renovations to a building adjacent to the former Blackwood property, workers discovered a sealed metal tube containing a letter addressed to any authority of conscience and justice. The letter, dated October 17, 1844, was signed Eleanor Blackwood. "By the time this is read, I fear we will all be beyond help," the letter begins. "Alexander's madness has progressed beyond my worst fears. This morning, after Jeremiah's departure, he gathered us in the parlor and announced that tonight would bring the culmination of our purpose. He spoke of purification through fire, of vessels being emptied to make room for something greater. I am locked in my chamber. I have been permitted this brief solitude to prepare myself spiritually," as he phrased it. "Instead, I write these words, though I have little hope they will reach sympathetic eyes in time." The letter continues with a chilling account of Alexander's deterioration over the preceding months, his increasingly frequent sessions with her in the hidden room, and his cryptic references to the arrival of those who will complete our circle. Eleanor expresses particular concern about the expected arrival of Martinez and his acolyte that evening. I have heard them speaking of the alignment of stars, of a gateway that opens only once in a generation. Alexander believes that through the proper ritual involving what he calls the offering of vessels, something can be called through this gateway. What this means, I dare not contemplate too deeply. I know only that my life is in imminent danger, and I have no means of saving myself. Eleanor's letter provides the most explicit description yet of what Alexander had been planning. He has marked 5 points around the parlor floor. He calls them anchors for the pentagram. At each point, he intends to place a vessel, a living person whose life force will, in his words, fuel the opening. I am to be the central point, the conduit through which it enters. The household staff he has retained, those poor souls who did not have the foresight to flee as others did, are to form the outer points. Most disturbing is her description of Alexander's transformation. He is no longer the man I married. Something looks out through his eyes that is ancient and cold. When he speaks of the ritual, his voice changes, becoming deeper, and somehow layered, as if multiple voices emerge simultaneously. He refers to himself as we in these moments. Last night, I observed him standing before the mirror, conversing with his reflection as if it were a separate entity. The reflection moved independently, its lips forming different words than those Alexander spoke. I can no longer deny the truth that has been growing in my mind these past months. Whatever Martinez introduced him to in Cuba has possessed him utterly. The letter concludes, "If Providence allows these words to be discovered, know that whatever explanation is given for what occurs here tonight, the truth is far darker. Alexander intends a sacrifice, and I, God forgive me, am too weak to prevent it. I can only pray that the flames he speaks of with such reverence consume whatever evil he intends to invoke along with us all." This document, subjected to rigorous authentication, appears to have been written just hours before the fire began. Its implications are profoundly disturbing, suggesting not a tragic accident, nor even a conventional murder, but rather some form of ritualistic sacrifice. The reference to Martinez's acolyte may explain the identity of additional bodies, while the mention of flames suggests that the fire was not set to conceal a crime after the fact, but was itself an integral part of whatever ceremony Alexander had planned. The final hours in the Blackwood mansion remain largely unknown. What communications took place between Alexander and the others, what preparations were made, these details died in the flames along with those present. But certain physical evidence, documented in the coroner's suppressed notes, suggests that the end was not swift. The bodies were found arranged in a specific pattern in what remained of the parlor. Residue on wrist bones indicated that at least some of the victims had been restrained. Most tellingly, the coroner noted that the positions of the remains suggested that none of the victims had attempted to flee the fire, an unnatural response that implies they were either already deceased when the flames began or physically unable to escape. An additional detail from the coroner's notes, excised from the official report but preserved in his personal journal, described an anomaly observed in Alexander's remains. The skull of the male, identified as A. Blackwood, exhibits an unusual deformation not consistent with fire damage or any known pathology. The cranium appears to have ruptured outward from within, with fracture patterns suggesting an explosive force originating inside the skull cavity. No explanation for this phenomenon can be provided based on current medical understanding. What motivated Alexander Blackwood to orchestrate such a horrific end? The question has haunted researchers for generations. Financial pressures alone seem insufficient explanation for such extreme actions. The correspondence with Martinez suggests involvement in some form of illicit trade, perhaps smuggling or worse, but even this fails to account for the ritualistic elements described in Eleanor's final letter. Some have proposed that Alexander suffered from a severe mental disorder, perhaps exacerbated by the stresses of his business failures. Medical records from the period indicate that he consulted a physician in early 1844 regarding persistent headaches and episodes of absence from himself, potentially symptoms of a neurological condition. The physician prescribed a regime of bloodletting and mineral baths, standard treatments of the era, but unlikely to have provided relief for any serious condition. Dr. James Metcalfe's notes from Alexander's consultation on February 12, 1844, contain a curious observation. Patient reports increasing frequency of what he terms visitations, episodes during which he experiences the sensation of another consciousness temporarily occupying his mind. These episodes are preceded by severe cephalgia, headache, and accompanied by auditory phenomena, specifically a sound like distant chanting or murmuring voices. Patient attributes these experiences to messages from beyond the veil and seems disinclined to view them as symptoms of illness. Most concerning is his statement that during these episodes he receives instructions for the great work that approaches. Others have suggested that Alexander fell under the influence of certain occult practices that had taken root in New Orleans during this period. The city's unique cultural blend, French, Spanish, African, Caribbean, created fertile ground for various esoteric traditions to flourish, often hidden behind the facade of conventional religious observance. Alexander's business trips to Havana, documented in shipping records, may have exposed him to specific ritualistic practices not commonly known in the United States at that time. Professor Émile Devereaux, a historian specializing in Caribbean religious practices at Tulane University, has suggested that Alexander may have encountered a specific cult active in certain regions of Cuba during the 1830s and 40s. In a monograph published in 1912, Devereaux wrote, "Historical records indicate the existence of a sect known as Los que Esperan, those who wait, operating primarily in the eastern provinces. This group combined elements of native Taino beliefs, African traditions brought by slaves, and corrupted Catholic practices into a syncretic system centered on the veneration of entities they called Los Antiguos, the Ancient Ones." Devereaux continues, "The central tenet of their belief system was that these Ancient Ones existed in a realm parallel to our own, separated by what they termed el velo, the veil. According to recovered texts, this veil grew thin during specific celestial alignments, allowing for potential communication and, in extreme circumstances, physical manifestation. The rituals associated with such manifestations invariably involved human sacrifice, with the belief that the life force released during death created a temporary breach in the veil. Most significantly, Devereaux notes that the sacrifice was typically conducted within a pentagram formation, with 5 participants forming the points and a 6th serving as the central conduit. The ritual culminated in what was called la purificación, a conflagration that consumed the participants and, according to their beliefs, facilitated the transfer of an entity from the other side of the veil into our world. The parallels between these practices and the arrangements described in Eleanor's final letter are striking. If Alexander had indeed become involved with this cult, or one similar to it during his Cuban travels, it might explain the transformation in his behavior, his preoccupation with astronomical alignments, and the ritualistic nature of the events, leading to the fire. Juan Martinez, Alexander's Cuban business associate, remains an enigmatic figure in the narrative. What little is known about him comes from customs records, which identify him as a merchant of specialty goods, and from fragmentary correspondence found among Alexander's business papers. These letters, often written in a mixture of Spanish and encoded phrases, suggest a relationship that extended beyond ordinary commerce. One letter from Martinez to Alexander, dated July 1844, makes cryptic reference to the approaching convergence and preparations that must be completed before the window closes. The letter concludes with a postscript. "The text you requested has been located. It is as ancient as promised and contains the formula you seek. The price is considerable, but such knowledge has always demanded sacrifice." A subsequent letter, dated August 17th, contains what appears to be instructions for a ritual. The 5 points must be occupied by willing or unwilling vessels. This is immaterial, as consent is not required from the mortal form. The central position, however, must be filled by one who bears your blood or has merged blood with yours. A spouse is ideal. The binding must be complete when the alignment reaches its apex. Our calculations indicate this will occur at approximately 11:17 p.m. on October 17th. The gate will remain open for precisely 3 minutes and 27 seconds. What passes through in that time will require immediate accommodation in a prepared vessel. Failure to provide such accommodation will result in uncontrolled manifestation, with consequences that cannot be predicted or contained. The nature of the text referenced in these letters remains unknown. No books or manuscripts of an unusual nature were listed in the inventory of items recovered from the ruins. However, a curious entry in Thomas Harrington's personal ledger, dated November 1844, records the payment of a substantial sum to J.M. for retrieval of property from Customs House. This timing, just weeks after the fire, raises questions about what Harrington might have removed from the Blackwood holdings before authorities conducted their inventory. The involvement of Thomas Harrington in the aftermath of the tragedy deserves particular scrutiny. As Alexander's business partner, he stood to gain the most from his death, and his actions in the days following the fire suggest a man with something to conceal. He arranged for the funeral with unusual haste, pressed authorities to conclude their investigation quickly, and took steps to liquidate the Blackwood business interests before distant relatives could make claims. Yet Harrington's own correspondence from this period paints a picture of a man genuinely disturbed by what had occurred. In a letter to his brother in Virginia, written 3 days after the fire, he described himself as haunted by Alexander's transformation these past months. He wrote, "I knew him for 15 years as a rational, measured man. What he became in these final weeks was unrecognizable to me. The last time we met, 2 days before the tragedy, he spoke of transcendence through purification and claimed that his wife had been chosen as a vessel. I attributed such talk to the strain of our recent losses, but I now fear I missed signs of a deeper derangement." This letter suggests that Harrington was aware of Alexander's deteriorating mental state, but failed to intervene. Whether this failure stemmed from simple misjudgment or a more calculated decision to allow events to unfold to his benefit remains a matter of debate among historians who have studied the case. A more troubling possibility emerges from a fragment of correspondence found among Harrington's papers after his death in Paris in 1868. This letter, apparently a draft that was never sent, addressed to an unnamed recipient, contains a passage that suggests a deeper involvement than Harrington publicly acknowledged. The agreement was for financial support only. I never consented to the use of human subjects in the experiments. When A revealed the full extent of his intentions, I withdrew my participation entirely. That he proceeded, despite my objections, weighs heavily upon my conscience, but I maintain that legal and moral responsibility rests solely with him and M. My hands remain clean, if not my conscience. This fragment raises the possibility that Harrington had knowledge of, and perhaps initially supported, whatever esoteric pursuits Alexander had become involved in, only withdrawing his support when the nature of the intended ritual became clear. His subsequent actions, the hasty conclusion of the investigation, the retrieval of items from the Customs House, his eventual relocation to Europe, could be interpreted as attempts to distance himself from events he had indirectly enabled. The final years of Thomas Harrington's life were marked by increasing paranoia and declining health. Acquaintances in Paris described him as constantly vigilant, as if expecting some unwelcome visitor. He changed residences frequently, often without forwarding his address to associates. His death in 1868 was officially attributed to heart failure, but the physician who attended him in his final hours noted that Harrington died in a state of extreme terror, crying out about the circle being closed and the 5 points reconnecting. In the decades since these discoveries, the Blackwood case has remained a subject of periodic interest among historians of New Orleans and students of the macabre. The park that now occupies the site where the mansion once stood is rarely busy, despite its location in an otherwise popular area. Visitors often report an inexplicable sense of unease, a heaviness in the air that discourages lingering. More striking are the accounts from nearby residents who claim that on certain October nights, particularly when the date of the 17th approaches, the scent of smoke drifts through the area, regardless of wind direction or weather conditions. Some report hearing sounds that they struggle to describe, not quite voices, but something that seems to carry human intonation without forming distinct words. These phenomena, while impossible to verify scientifically, have been reported with remarkable consistency over generations. Perhaps most disturbing are the 5 disappearances that have occurred on the site between 1844 and the present day. In 1862, a Union soldier stationed in occupied New Orleans vanished while crossing the park after dark. In 1885, a local journalist investigating the Blackwood case for a retrospective article failed to return from a night spent on the property. Similar incidents occurred in 1901, 1928, and 1961. In each case, no trace of the missing person was ever found, despite thorough searches of the area. A peculiar pattern emerges when these dates are examined. They occur at intervals of approximately 17 to 23 years, with no discernible regularity, except that each disappearance took place on October 17th. This has led some researchers to speculate about a connection to celestial cycles, perhaps the same alignment referenced in Martinez's correspondence with Alexander. In 1944, exactly 1 century after the fire, a historical society commissioned a limited excavation of the site, hoping to discover additional artifacts that might shed further light on the Blackwood tragedy. The project was abandoned after 3 days when the lead archaeologist, Dr. Victor Morton, suffered what was described as an acute psychological episode after examining soil samples from what would have been the mansion's cellar level. Morton never returned to academic work, and the notes from his brief investigation were reportedly destroyed at his request. A nurse who attended Morton during his subsequent hospitalization reported that he repeatedly muttered the phrase, "Still active. The gate is still open." When questioned about this statement after his recovery, Morton claimed to have no recollection of making it, nor of what triggered his breakdown. He refused all subsequent requests to discuss the Blackwood site, saying only that some ground should remain undisturbed. The physical site of the Blackwood mansion has maintained its unsettling reputation through generations of New Orleans residents. The failed attempts to develop or normalize the property, the persistent reports of unusual phenomena, and the extreme reaction of Dr. Morton during his 1944 investigation suggest that the events of October 17, 1844, left an impression on the high location that extends beyond historical memory into something more tangible, at least in the perception of those who encounter it. In 1967, during renovation of the park's irrigation system, workers uncovered a peculiar object buried approximately 6 feet below the surface in what would have been directly beneath the Blackwood mansion's parlor. This artifact, a small stone, cube measuring roughly 4 inches on each side, was covered with inscriptions similar to those described in accounts of Alexander's private writings. When exposed to direct sunlight, the stone reportedly exhibited unusual properties, seeming to absorb rather than reflect light, creating what one worker described as a shadow darker than shadow itself. The cube was transferred to the Louisiana State Museum for analysis, but disappeared from the collection room overnight, less than 24 hours after its discovery. The security guard on duty reported nothing unusual, though he complained of a severe headache and strange dreams during his shift. No explanation for the object's disappearance was ever established, and its current whereabouts remain unknown. The most recent development in the Blackwood case occurred in 2004, when a graduate student in anthropology at Tulane University, researching cultural exchanges between New Orleans and the Caribbean in the 19th century, discovered a journal believed to have belonged to Juan Martinez. The document, found in the archives of the University of Havana, provides disturbing context for Martinez's relationship with Alexander Blackwood. According to this journal, Martinez was a fourth-generation member of La Orden de la Puerta, the Order of the Gate, a secret society dedicated to the worship of entities they called Los que esperan detrás, those who wait behind. The order believed that these entities existed in a realm parallel to our own, separated by what they termed el velo delgado, the thin veil. Martinez's journal describes his first meeting with Alexander in 1839. I recognized the potential immediately. He possesses the rare combination of intellectual curiosity, financial resources, and moral flexibility that the order requires in its foreign initiates. More importantly, he exhibits the signs of receptivity, the capacity to serve as a temporary vessel during the preliminary communions. I have begun the process of gradual revelation, presenting our practices initially as merely academic curiosities. His eagerness to learn more confirms my initial assessment. Subsequent entries document Alexander's increasing involvement with the order, culminating in his formal initiation during an extended visit to Cuba in 1842. Martinez writes, "The communion was successful beyond all expectations. Most initiates require multiple exposures before achieving even momentary connection with those who wait. But A established contact during the very first ceremony. The entity that responded to his call identified itself as Thalassos, one of few, the lesser watchers. For nearly 3 minutes it spoke through A's mouth, using the ancient tongue that few mortals can pronounce correctly. The other members were astonished.